The Man Who Drew Cats by Michael Marshall Smith. This was his first published story, which I think is kind of cool. It was from 1990. Okay. Tom was a very tall man, so tall he didn't even have a nickname for it. Ned Black, who was at least a head shorter, had been Tower Block since the 6th grade. And Jack had a sign up over the door saying, "Mind your head, Ned." But Tom was just Tom. It was like he was so tall it didn't bear mentioning even for a joke. A bit like ragging someone for breathing. Of course, there were other reasons, too, for not ragging Tom about his height or anything else. The guys you'll find perched on stools around Jack's bar watching the game and buying beers, they've known each other forever. Gone to Miss Stadler's school together, gotten under each other's mom's feet, double-dated right up to giving each other's best man speech. Kingstown is a small place, you understand. The old boys who come regular to Jack's mostly spent their childhoods in the same treehouse. Of course, they'd since gone their separate ways up to a point. Pete was an accountant now. Had a small office down Union Street just off the square. Did pretty good. Whereas Ned was still pumping gas and changing oil, and after 40 years he did that pretty good too. Comes a time when men have known each other so long they forget what they do for a living most of the time, because it just don't matter. When you talk, there's a little bit of skimming stones down the quarry in 2nd grade, a whisper of dolling up to go to that first dance, tad of going to the housewarming when they moved 10 years back. There's all that, so much more than you can say. None of it's important except for having happened. So we'll stop by and have a couple beers and talk about the town and rag each other. The pleasure's just in shooting the breeze, and it don't really matter what's said, just the fact that we're still there to say it. But Tom, he was different. We all remember the first time we saw him. It was a long, hot summer like we hadn't seen in 10 years since. We were lolling under the fans at Jack's and complaining about the tourists. Kingstown does get its share in the summer, even though it's not near the sea and we don't have a McDonald's, and I'll be damned if I can figure out why folks would go out of their way to see what's just a quiet little town near some mountains. It was as hot as hell that afternoon, as much as a man could do to sit in his shirt sleeves and drink the coolest beer he could find. And Jack's is the coolest for us. Always will be, I guess. Then Tom walked in. His hair was already pretty white back then, long. His face was brown and tough with gray eyes like diamonds set in leather. He was dressed mainly in black with a long coat that made you hot just to look at it. But he looked comfortable, like he carried his very own weather around with him, and he was just fine. He got a beer and sat down at a table and read the town bugle, and that was that. It was special because there wasn't anything special about it. Jack's bar isn't exactly exclusive, and we don't all turn around and stare at anyone new if they come in. That place is like a monument to shared times. If a tourist couple comes in out of the heat and sits down, nobody says anything. Maybe nobody even notices at the front of their mind. It's like there's a little island of the alien in the water, and the currents just don't ebb and flow the way they usually do, if you get what I mean. Tom just walked in and sat down. It was all right, because it was like he was there just like we were, and could have been for 30 years. He sat and read his paper like part of the same river, and everyone just carried on downstream the way they were. Pretty soon he goes up for another beer, and a few of us got talking to him. We got his name and what he did. Painting, he said. After that, it was just shooting the breeze. That quick. He came in that summer afternoon and just fell into the conversation like he'd been there all his life. Sometimes it was hard to imagine he hadn't been. Nobody knew where he came from, where he'd been. There was something real quiet about him. A stillness. A man in a slightly different world. But he showed enough to get along real well with us, and a bunch of old friends don't often let someone in like that. Anyway, he stayed that whole summer. Rented himself a place just round the corner from the square, so he said. I never saw it. I guess no one did. He was a private man. Private like a steel door with 4 bars and a couple of 6-inch padlocks, and when he left the square at the end of the day, he could have vanished as soon as he turned the corner for all we knew. But he always came back in that direction in the morning, with his easel on his back and paint box under his arm. He always wore that black coat like it was a part of him. But he always looked cool. And the funny thing was, when you stood near him, you could swear you felt cooler yourself. I remember Pete saying over a beer that it wouldn't surprise him none if, assuming it ever rained again, Tom would walk around in his own column of dryness. He was just joking, of course, but Tom made you think things like that. Jack's Bar looks right out onto the square. The kind of square towns don't have much anymore. Big and dusty with old roads out each corner, tall shops and houses on all the sides, and some stone paving in the middle around a fountain that ain't worked in living memory. Well, in that summer, the old square is just full of out-of-towners in pink toweling jumpsuits, nasty jackets, standing around saying, "Wow," taking pictures of our quaint old hall, our quaint old stores, even our quaint old selves if we stand still long enough. Tom would sit out near the fountain and paint, and those people would stand and watch for hours. But he didn't paint the houses or the square or the old picture house. He painted animals, painted them like you've never seen. Birds with huge blue speckled wings and cats with cutting green eyes. Whatever he painted, it looked like it could just coil up on the canvas and fly away. He didn't do them in their normal colors. They were all reds and purples and deep blues and greens, yet they fairly sparkled with life. It was a wonder to watch. He'd put up a fresh paper, sit looking at nothing in particular, and dip his brush into his paint and draw a line, maybe red, maybe blue. Then he'd add another, maybe the same color, maybe not. Stroke by stroke, you could see the animal build up in front of your eyes, yet when it was finished, you couldn't believe it hadn't always been there. When he'd finish, he'd spray it with some stuff to fix the paint and put a price on it. You can believe me, those paintings were sold before they hit the ground. Spreading businessmen from New Jersey or some such and their bored wives would come alive for maybe the first time in years, walk away with one of those paintings and their arms round each other, looking like they'd found a bit of something they'd forgotten they'd lost. Come about 6 o'clock, Tom would finish up and walk across to Jack's, looking like a sailor's ship among rowing boats, saying yes, he'd be back again tomorrow, and yes, he'd be happy to do a painting for them. He'd get a beer and sit with us and watch the game, and there'd be no paint on his fingers or his clothes, not a spot. I figured he's got so much control over that paint it went where it was told and nowhere else. I asked him once how he could bear to let those paintings go. I know if I'd been able to make anything that good in my whole life, I couldn't let it out of my sight. I'd want to keep it to look at sometimes. He thought for a moment, and then he said he believed it depends on how much of yourself you've put into it. If you've gone deep down and pulled up what's inside and put it down, you don't want to let it go. You want to keep it, so you can check sometimes if it's still safely tied down. Comes a time when a painting is so right and so good that it's private, no one will understand it except the man who put it down. Only he's going to know what he's talking about. But the everyday paintings, well, they were mainly just because he liked to paint animals and liked for people to have them. He could only put a piece of himself into something he was going to sell, but they paid for the beers, and I guess it's like us fellows in Jack's Bar. If you like talking, you don't always have to be saying something important. Why animals? Well, if you'd seen him with them, I guess you wouldn't have to ask. He loved them, is all, and they loved him right back. The cats were always his favorites. My old pa used to say that cats weren't nothing but sleeping machines put on the earth to do some of human sleeping for them. Whenever Tom worked in the square, there'd always be a couple curled up near his feet. Whenever he did a chalk drawing, he'd always do a cat. Once in a while, you see, Tom seemed to get tired of painting on paper. He'd get out some chalks and sit down on the baking flagstones and just do a drawing right there on the dusty rock. Now, I've told you about his paintings. These drawings were something else again. It was like because they couldn't be bought but would be washed away, he was putting more of himself into it, doing more than just shooting the breeze. They were just chalk on dusty stone, and they were still in these weird colors. I tell you, children wouldn't walk near them because they looked so real. And they weren't the only ones either. People would stand a few feet back and stare, and you could see the wonder in their eyes. If they could have been bought, there were people who would have sold their houses. I'm telling you. It's a funny thing, but a couple times when I walked over to open the door up in the morning, I saw a dead bird or two on top of these drawings, almost like they'd landed on it and been so terrified to find themselves right on top of a cat, they'd dropped dead of fright. They must have been dumped there by some real cats, of course, because some of these birds looked like they'd been mauled a bit. I used to throw them in the bushes to tidy up, and some of them were pretty broken up. Old Tom was a godsend for a lot of mothers that summer who found they could leave their little ones by him, do their shopping in peace, and have a soda with their friends and come back to find the kids still sitting quietly watching Tom paint. He didn't mind them at all, would talk to them and make them laugh, and kids of that age, laughing is one of the best sounds there is. It's the kind of sound that makes the trees grow. They're young and curious, and the world spins around them, and when they laugh, the world seems a brighter place, because it takes you back to the time when you knew no evil and everything was good. Or if it wasn't, it would be over by tomorrow. And here I guess I finally come down to it, because there was one little boy who didn't laugh much, just sat quiet and watchful. Guess he probably understands more of what happened that summer than any of us, though maybe not in words he could tell. His name was Billy McNeil. He was Jim Valentine's kid. Jim used to be a mechanic, working with Ned up at the gas station and raced beat-up cars after hours, which is why his kid is called McNeil now. One Sunday, Jim took a corner a mite too fast, and the car rolled, and the gas tank caught, and they never did find all the wheels. A year later, his Mary married again. God alone knows why. Her folks had warned her. Her friends warned her. I guess love must have just been blind. Sam McNeil's work schedule was at best pretty empty. Mostly he just drank and hung out with his friends, who maybe weren't always this side of the law. I guess Mary had her own sad little miracle and got her sight back pretty soon, because it wasn't long before Sam got free with his fists when the evenings got too long. He'd had a lot too many. You didn't see Mary around much anymore. In these parts, people tend to stare at black eyes on a woman. A deaf man could hear the whisperings of, "We told her so." One morning, Tom was sitting painting as usual, and little Billy was sitting watching him. Usually he just wandered off after a while, but this morning Mary was at the doctor's, and she came out to collect him, walking quickly with her face lowered, but not low enough. I was watching from the store. It was kind of a slow day. Tom's face never showed much. He was a man for a quiet smile and a raised eyebrow, but he looked shocked that morning. Mary's eyes were puffed and purple, and there was a cut on her cheek an inch long. Guess we'd sort of gotten used to seeing her like that. If the truth be known, some of the wives thought she'd got remarried a bit on the soon side. I suppose we may have all been a bit cold towards her, Jim Valentine having been so well liked and all. Tom looked from the little boy who never laughed much to his mom with her tired, unhappy eyes and her beat-up face. His own face went from shocked to stony. I can't describe it any other way. Then I felt a cold chill cross my heart from right across the square. But then he smiled and ruffled little Billy's hair. Mary took Billy's hand and they went off. They turned back once, and Tom was still looking after them. He gave Billy a little wave, and he waved back. Mother and child smiled together. That night in Jack's, Tom put a quiet question about Mary, and we told him the story. As he listened, his face seemed to harden from within, his eyes growing flat and dead. We told him that old Lou Latchance, who lived next door to the McNeils, said that sometimes you would hear him shouting, her pleading, till 3 a.m. On still nights, the sound of Billy crying for even longer than that. Told him it was a shame, but what could you do? Folks keep themselves out of other people's faces around here. I guess Sam and his drinking buddies didn't have much to fear from nearby retirees like us anyhow. Told him it was a terrible thing. None of us liked it. These things happened, and what could you do? Tom listened and didn't say a word. Just sat there in his black coat and listened to us pass the buck. After a while, the talk sort of petered out, and we all sat and watched the bubbles in our beers. I guess the bottom line was that none of us had really thought about it much, except as another chapter of small-town gossip. Jesus Christ, did I feel ashamed about that by the time we'd finished telling it. Sitting there with Tom was no laughs at all. He had a real edge to him, and seemed more unknown than known that night. He stared at his laced fingers for a long time, and he began real slow to talk. He'd been married once, he said, a long time ago. He lived in a place called Stevensburg with his wife Rachel. When he talked about her, the air seemed to go softer, and we all sat quiet, sipped our beers, and remembered how it had been way back when we first loved our own wives. He talked of her smile and the look in her eyes. When we went home that night, I guess there were a few wives who were surprised at how tight they got hugged, who went to sleep in their husbands' arms, feeling more loved and contented than they had in a long while. He'd loved her, and she him. For a few years, they were the happiest people on earth. Then a third party had got involved. Tom didn't say his name, and he spoke real neutrally about him. It was a gentleness like silk wrapped around a knife. Anyway, his wife fell in love with him, or thought she had. Leastways, she slept with him in their bed, the bed they'd come to use on their wedding night. As Tom spoke these words, some of us looked up at him startled, like we'd been slapped across the face. Rachel did what so many do and lived to regret till their dying day. She was so mixed up and getting so much pressure from the other guy that she decided to plow on with one mistake, make it the biggest in the world. She left Tom. He talked with her, pleaded even. It was almost impossible to imagine Tom ever doing that. I guess the man we knew was a different guy from the one he was remembering. The pleading made no difference. She left Tom. And so Tom had to carry on living in Stevensburg, walking the same tracks, seeing them around, wondering if she was as free and easy with him, if the light in her eyes was shining on him now. And each time the man saw Tom, he'd look straight at him and crease a little smile, a grin that said he knew about the pleading, and he and his cronies had had a good laugh over the wedding bed. Yes, I'm going home with your wife tonight. I know just how she likes it. You want to compare notes? And then he'd turn and kiss Rachel on the mouth, his eyes on Tom, smiling, and she let him do it. It had kept stupid old women in stores for weeks, the way Tom kept losing weight and his temper and the will to live. He took 3 months of it and then left without bothering to sell the house. Stevensburg was where he'd grown up and courted and loved, and now, wherever he turned, the good times had rotted, hung like fly-blown corpses in all the cherished places. He'd never been back. It took an hour to tell, and then he stopped talking a while, lit a 100th cigarette, and Pete got us all some more beers. We were sitting sad and thoughtful, tired like we'd lived it ourselves. I guess most of us had, some little bit of it. Had we ever loved anyone the way he'd loved her? I doubt it. Not all of us put together. Pete set the beers down, and Ned asked Tom why he hadn't just beaten the living shit out of the guy. Now, no one else would have actually asked that, but Ned's a good guy. Guess we were all with him in feeling a bit of that oldest and most crushing hatred in the world, the hate of a man who's lost the woman he loves to another. We knew what Ned was saying. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I know you're not supposed to feel like that these days. Show me a man who says he doesn't, and I'll show you a liar. Love is the only feeling worth a tin shit, but you got to know that it comes from both sides of a man's character. The deeper it runs, the darker the pools it draws from. My guess is he just hated that man too much to hit him. Comes a time when that isn't enough, when nothing is ever going to be enough, so you can't do anything at all. As he talked, the pain just flowed out like a river that wasn't ever going to be stopped, a river that had cut a channel through every corner of his soul. I learned something that night. You can just go your whole life without realizing. There are things that can be done that can mess someone up so badly for so long, they just cannot be allowed. There's some kinds of pain that you cannot suffer to be brought into the world. And then Tom was done telling, and he raised a smile and said that in the end he hadn't done anything to the man except paint him a picture, which I didn't understand. Tom looked like he'd talked all he was ever going to. So we got some more beers and shot some quiet pool before going home. I guess we all knew what he'd been talking about. Billy McNeil was just a child. He should have been dancing through a world like a big fun fair full of sunlight and sounds, and instead he went home at night and saw his mom being beaten up by a man with shit for brains who struck out at a good woman because he was too stupid to deal with the world. Most kids go to sleep thinking about bikes and climbing trees and skipping stones. He was lying there hearing his mom get smashed in the stomach and then hit again as she threw up in the sink. Tom didn't say any of that, but he did. We knew he was right. That summer kept up bright and hot. We all had our businesses to attend to. Jack sold a lot of beer. I sold a lot of ice cream. Sorry, ma'am, just the 3 flavors, and no, bubblegum pistachio ain't one of them. And Ned fixed a whole bunch of cracked radiators. Tom sat right out there in the square with a couple cats by his feet and a crowd around him, magicking up animals in the sun. And I think after that night, Mary maybe got a few more smiles as she did her shopping. Maybe a few more wives stopped by to talk to her. She looked a lot better, too. Sam had a job by the sound of it, and her face healed up pretty soon. You could often see her standing holding Billy's hand as they watched Tom paint for a while before they went home. I think she realized they had a friend in him. Sometimes Billy was there all afternoon. He was happy there in the sun by Tom's feet. Oftentimes he'd pick up a piece of chalk and sit scrawling on the pavement. Sometimes I'd see Tom lean over and say something to him, and he'd look up and smile, a simple child's smile that beamed in the sunlight. The tourists kept coming, the sun kept shining. It's one of those summers that go on forever and stick in a child's mind, tell you what summer should be like for the rest of your life. I'm damn sure it sticks in Billy's mind, just like it does in all of ours. Because one morning, Mary didn't come into the store, which had gotten to be a regular sort of thing. Billy wasn't out there in the square. After the way things had been the last few weeks, that could only be bad news. So I left the boy John in charge of the store and hurried over to have a word with Tom. I was kind of worried. I was no more than halfway across to him when I saw Billy come running from the opposite corner of the square, going straight to Tom. He was crying fit to burst and just leaped up at Tom and clung to him, his arms wrapped tight round his neck. And his mother came across from the same direction, running as best she could. She got to Tom, and they just looked at each other. Mary's a real pretty girl, but you wouldn't have believed it then. Looked like he'd actually broken her nose this time. Blood was streaming out of her lip. She started sobbing, saying Sam had lost his job because he was back on the drink. What could she do? And then suddenly there was a roar. I was shoved aside, and Sam was standing there, still wearing his slippers, moving back and forth and radiating that aura of violence that keeps men like him safe. He started shouting at Mary to take the kid the fuck back home, and she just flinched and covered closer to Tom like she was huddling around a fire to keep out the cold. This just got Sam even wilder, and he staggered forward and told Tom to get the hell out if he knew what was good for him, grabbed Mary's arm and tried to yank her towards him, his face terrible with rage. Then Tom stood up. Now Tom was a tall man. He wasn't a young man, and he was thin. Sam was 30 and built like the town hall. When he did work, it usually involved moving heavy things from one place to another. His strength was supercharged by a whole pile of drunken nastiness. But at that moment, the crowd stepped back as one, and I suddenly felt very afraid for Sam McNeil. Tom looked like he could take anything you carried to him and it would just break, like he was a huge spike of granite wrapped in skin with 2 holes in the face where the rock showed through. And he was mad. Not hot and blowing like Sam, but mad and cold. There was a long pause. And Sam weaved back a step and shouted, "You just come on home, you hear? Gonna be real trouble if you don't, Mary. Real trouble." Then stormed off across the square the way he came, knocking his way through the tourist vultures, soaking up the spicy local color. Mary turned to Tom, so afraid it hurt to see, said she guessed she'd better be going. Tom looked at her for a moment and then spoke for the first time. "Do you love him?" "Even if you wanted to, you ain't gonna lie to eyes like that, for fear something inside you will break." Real quiet, she said, "No." Began crying softly as she took Billy's hand and walked slowly back across the square. Tom packed up his stuff and walked over to Jack's. I went with him and had a beer, but I had to get back to the shop, and Tom just sat there like a trigger, silent and strung up tight as a drum. Somewhere down near the bottom of those still waters, something was stirring, something I thought I didn't want to see. About an hour later, it was lunchtime, and I just left the shop to have a break when suddenly something whacked into the back of my legs and nearly knocked me down. It was Billy. It was Billy, and he had a bruise around his eyes that was already closing it up. I knew what the only thing to do was, and I did it. I took his hand and led him across to the bar, feeling a hard anger pushing against my throat. When he saw Tom, Billy ran to him again, and Tom took him in his arms and looked over Billy's shoulder at me. I felt my own anger collapse utterly in the face of a fury I could never have generated. I tried to find a word to describe it, but they all just seemed like they were in the wrong language. All I can say is I wanted to be somewhere else, felt real cold standing there facing that stranger in a black coat. Then the moment passed and Tom was holding the kid close, ruffling his hair and talking to him in a low voice, murmuring the words I thought only mothers knew. He dried Billy's tears and checked his eye, and then he got off his stool, smiled down at him and said, "I think it's time we did some drawing. What do you say?" Taking the kid's hand, he picked up his chalk box and walked out into the square. I don't know how many times I looked up and watched them that afternoon. They were sitting side by side on the stone, Billy's little hand wrapped around one of Tom's fingers, Tom doing one of his chalk drawings. Every now and then, Billy would reach across and add a little bit. Tom would smile and say something, and Billy's gurgling laugh would float across the square. The store was real busy that afternoon. I was chained to that counter. I could tell by the size of the crowd that a lot of Tom was going into that picture, maybe a bit of Billy, too. It was about 4 o'clock before I could take a break. I walked across the crowded square in the mid-afternoon heat and shouldered my way through to where they sat with a couple cold Cokes. When I saw it, my mouth just dropped open and took a 5-minute vacation while I tried to take it in. It was a cat, all right, but not a normal cat. It was a life-size tiger. I'd never seen Tom do anything near that big before. As I stood there in the beating sun trying to get my mind around it, it almost seemed to stand in 3 dimensions, a nearly living thing. Its stomach was very lean and thin. Its tail seemed to twitch with color. As Tom worked on the eyes and jaws, his face set with a rigid concentration quite unlike his usual calm painting face. The snarling mask of the tiger came to life before my eyes. All I could see that he wasn't just putting a bit of himself in it at all. There was a man at full stretch, giving all of himself, reaching down for more, pulling up bloody fistfuls and throwing them down. The tiger was all the rage I'd seen in his eyes and more. Like his love for Rachel, that rage just seemed bigger than any other man could comprehend. It was pouring it out and sculpting it into the lean and ravenous creature coming to pulsating life in front of us on the pavement. The weird purples and blues and red just made it seem more vibrant and alive. I watched him working furiously on it, the boy sometimes helping, adding a tiny bit here and there that strangely seemed to add to it. Thought I understood what he meant that evening a few weeks back. He said he'd done a painting for the man who'd given him so much pain. Then, as now, he must have found what I guess you'd call something fancy like catharsis through all his skill with chalks, something solid that he could walk away from. Now he was helping that little boy do the same, and the boy did look better, his bruised eyes hardly showing with a wide smile on his face as he watched the big cat conjured up from nowhere in front of him. We all just stood and watched, like something out of an old story, the simple folk and the magical stranger. It always feels like you're giving a bit of yourself away when you praise someone else's creation. It's often done grudgingly. You could feel the awe that day like a warm wind. Comes a time when you realize something special is happening, something you're never going to see again. There isn't anything you can do but watch. Well, I had to go back to the store after a while. I hated to go, but, well, John is a good boy, married now, of course. In those days, his head was full of girls, and it didn't do to leave him alone in a busy shop for too long. And so the long, hot day drew slowly to a close. I kept the store open till 8, when the light began to turn and the square emptied out with all the tourists going away to write postcards and see if we didn't have even just a little McDonald's hidden away someplace. I suppose Mary had troubles enough at home, realized where the boy would be and figured he was safer there than anywhere else, and I guess she was right. Tom and Billy finished up drawing, and then Tom sat and talked to him for some time. Then they got up, and the kid walked slowly off to the corner of the square, looking back to wave at Tom a couple times. Tom stood and watched him go away. When Billy had gone, he stayed there a while, head down, like a huge black statue at the gathering dark. He looked kind of creepy out there. I don't mind telling you I was glad when he finally moved and started walking over towards Jack's. I ran out to catch up with him and drew level just as we passed the drawing. Then I had to stop. I just couldn't look at that and move at the same time. Finished, the drawing was like nothing on earth. I suppose that's exactly what it was. I can't hope to describe it to you, although I've seen it in my dreams many times in the last 10 years. You had to be there on that heavy summer night, had to know what was going on. Otherwise, it's going to sound like it was just a drawing. That tiger was out and out terrifying. Looked so mean and hungry. Christ, I don't know what. It just looked like the darkest part of mankind. The pain and the fury and the vengeful hate nailed down in front of you for you to see. I just stood there and shivered in the humid evening air. We did him a picture, Tom said. Yeah, I said, and nodded. Like I said, I know what catharsis means, and I thought I understood what he was saying. But I really didn't want to look at it much longer. Let's go have a beer, hey? The storm and Tom hadn't passed, I could tell, and he still seemed to thrum with crackling emotions looking for an earth. I thought the clouds might be breaking, and I was glad. So we walked slowly over to Jack's and had a few beers and watched some pool being played. Tom seemed pretty tired, but still alert. I relaxed a little. Come 11, most of the guys started going on their way, and I was surprised to see Tom get another beer. Pete, Ned, and I stayed on, and Jack, of course. We knew our loving wives would have something to say about that. Just didn't seem time to go. Outside it had gotten pretty dark, though the moon was keeping the square in a kind of twilight, and the lights in the bar threw a pool of warmth out the front window. Then, about 12 o'clock, it happened. I don't suppose any of us will ever see the same world we grew up in again. I've told this whole thing like it was just me who was there. We all were, and we remember it together. Because suddenly there was a wailing sound outside, a thin cutting cry getting closer. Tom immediately snapped to his feet and stared out the window like he'd been waiting for it. As we looked out across the square, we saw little Billy come running. We could see the blood on his face from there. Some of us got to get up, but Tom snarled at us to stay there, so I guess we just stayed put, sitting back down like we'd been pushed. He strode out the door and into the square, and the boy saw him and ran to him, and Tom folded him in his cloak and held him close and warm. But he didn't come back in. He just stood there, and he was waiting for something. Now, there's a lot of crap talk about silences. I read novels when I have the time, and you see things like time stood still, so on, and you think, bullshit, it did. So I'll just say I don't think anyone in the world breathed in that next minute. There was no wind, no movement. The stillness and silence were there like you could touch them, But more than that, they were like that's all there ever was and all there ever had been. We felt the slow red throb of violence from right across the square before we could even see the man. Then Sam came staggering into view, waving a bottle like a flag and cursing his head off. At first he couldn't see Tom and the boy because they were the opposite side of the fountain. He ground to a wavering halt, and he started shouting. Rough jags of sound that seemed to strike against the silence and die instead of breaking it began charging across the square. If ever there was a man with murder in his thoughts, then it was Sam McNeil. He was like a man who'd given his soul the evening off. I wanted to shout to Tom to get the hell out of the way, to come inside. The words wouldn't come out of my throat, and we all just stood there, knuckles whitening as we clutched the bar and stared, our mouths open like we'd made a pact never to use them again. Tom just stood there, watching Sam come toward him, getting closer, almost as far as the spot where Tom usually painted. It felt like we were looking out the window at a picture of something that happened long ago in another place and time. The closer Sam got, the more I began to feel very afraid for him. It was at that moment that Sam stopped dead in his tracks, skidding forward like some kid's cartoon, his shout dying off in his ragged throat. He was staring at the ground in front of him, his eyes wide and his mouth a stupid circle. Then he began to scream. It was a high, shrill noise like a woman coming out of that bull of a man. It sent fear racking down my spine. He started making thrashing movements like he was trying to move backwards, but he just stayed where he was. His movements became unmistakable at about the same time his screams turned from terror to agony. He was trying to get his leg away from something. Suddenly he seemed to fall forward on one knee. His other leg stuck out behind him. He raised his head and shrieked at the dark skies, and we saw his face then. I'm not going to forget that face as long as I live. It was a face from before there were any words. A face behind our oldest fears and earliest nightmares. A face we're terrified of seeing on ourselves one night when we're alone in the dark and it finally comes out from under the bed to get us, like we always knew it would. Then Sam fell on his face, his legs buckled up. Still he thrashed and screamed and clawed at the ground with his hands, blood running from his broken fingernails as he twitched and struggled. Maybe the light was playing tricks. My eyes were sparkling anyway on account of being too paralyzed with fear to even blink. As he thrashed less and less, it became harder and harder to see him at all. As the breeze whipped up stronger, his screams began to sound a lot like the wind. Still he writhed and moaned, then suddenly there was the most god-awful crunching sound, and there was no movement or sound anymore. Like they were on a string, our heads all turned together, and we saw Tom still standing there, his coat flapping in the wind. He had a hand on Billy's shoulder, and as we looked, we could see that Mary was there too. He had one arm around her as she sobbed into his coat. I don't know how long we just sat there staring, and then we were ejected off our seat and out of the bar. Pete and Ned ran to Tom, but Jack and I went to where Sam had fallen, and we stared down. I tell you, the rest of my life now seems like a build-up to and a climb down from that moment. We were standing in front of a chalk drawing of a tiger. Even now my scalp seems to tighten when I think of it. My chest feels like someone punched a hole in it and tipped a gallon of ice water inside. I'll just tell you the facts. Jack was there, and he knows what we saw and what we didn't see. What we didn't see was Sam McNeil. He just wasn't there. We saw a drawing of a tiger in purple and greens, a little bit scuffed. There was a lot more red around the mouth of that tiger than there had been that afternoon. And I'm sure that if either of us could have dreamed of reaching out and touching it, it would have been warm too. And the hardest part to tell is this. I'd seen that drawing in the afternoon, and Jack had too. We knew that when it was done, it was lean and thin. I swear to God that tiger wasn't thin anymore. What Jack and I were looking at was one fat tiger. After a while, I looked up and across at Tom. He was still standing with Mary and Billy, but they weren't crying anymore. Mary was hugging Billy so tight he squawked, and Tom's face looked calm and alive and creased with a smile. As we stood there, the skies opened for the first time in months, and a cool rain hammered down. My feet colors began to run, and lines became less distinct. Jack and I stood and watched till there were just pools of meaningless colors, and we walked back slowly over to the others, not even looking at the bottle lying on the ground. We all stayed there a long time in the rain, facing each other, not saying a word. Well, that was 10 years ago, near enough. After a while, Mary took Billy home, and they turned to give us a little wave before they turned the corner. The cuts on Billy's face healed real quick. He's a good-looking boy now. Looks a lot like his dad, and he's already fooling about in cars. Helps me in the store sometimes. His mom ain't aged a day and looks wonderful. She never married again, but she looks real happy the way she is. The rest of us just said a simple good night. Good night was all we could muster, and maybe that's all there was to say. Then we walked off home in the direction of our wives. Tom gave me a small smile before he turned and walked off alone. I almost followed him. I wanted to say something, and I just stayed where I was and watched him go. And that's how I'll always remember him best, because for a moment there was a spark in his eyes, and I knew that some pain had been lifted deep down inside somewhere. Then he walked, and no one has seen him since. Like I said, it's been about 10 years now. He wasn't there in the square the next morning, and he didn't come in for a beer. Like he'd never been. He just wasn't there, except for the hole in our hearts. It's funny how much you could miss a quiet man. We're all still here, of course. Jack, Ned, Pete, and the boys, and all much the same, though even older and grayer. Pete lost his wife. Ned retired, but things go on the same. The tourists come in the summer, and we sit on the stools and drink our cold beers and shoot the breeze about ball games and families and how the world's gone to shit. Sometimes we'll draw close and talk about a night a long time ago, about paintings and cats, about the quietest man we ever knew, wondering where he is and what he's doing. We've had a six-pack in the back of the fridge for 10 years now. The minute he walks through that door and pulls up a stool, that's his.